So, by way of announcements, next Sunday we will have a transition that'll take place for the month of November, and so I won't be up here behind the podium, but Kelly Bissinger will, and there's an announcement about that in the bulletin today, so I will read that to you, and we'll read it later. So the class Kelly's going to be teaching is based upon the conviction that as Christians we should give Caesar his due, but not more than his due. In other words, wise stewardship of what God has given us means that we should minimize what we give to Caesar so that we can maximize what we give to God. So we're calling this wise stewardship principles. The key text is Matthew 22. It'll start November 7th, 8:45 a.m. It'll meet in this room, and it'll go through the month of November. All right? So, and Kelly's going hunting with his son on the 14th. So I actually will be up here on the 14th. We'll have a little gap week, but the rest of the month will be on that topic. Okay? Does anybody need the notes that we're working through? Have you lost them or forgot them? Or never had them? Now, last week I said that we would make tracks on this because Kelly's going to be teaching, but actually since Kelly's going to be teaching one week and I'm going to be back the next week, I don't feel quite so in a hurry. Okay? So, what?
Are you going to give him your whistle?
Well, I don't know. They'll probably get more respect than me. You guys probably they just probably tone right down and pay total attention. And Bill told me that now, I was listening to Bill this morning. He said now that we have these speakers, you see these speakers, and Bill was saying he couldn't sleep through class because I'm louder. So I get no respect. I'm like, was it Rodney Dangerfield, and I get no respect? Yeah, Mel Krause. Some of you remember Mel. He would, yeah. All right, so I do want to mention three things before we turn attention to our notes today that are these are actually things in the news, but they're also issues that are going to be in the news next week, and all of them, I think, two of the three anyway, are of real significance. And the first one I'll just make mention of is the Virginia governor's race, which is this Tuesday. And I think that is a very important race to watch on Tuesday, not only because it determines who will be the governor in Virginia, but it is a sort of bellwether election where the whole nation will be watching because it has implications for the midterm elections next year, and it has implications for where the nation is at right now, what people are thinking and what people are feeling. And Virginia is a solidly blue state. That is to say, it votes Democrat, and it's become more that way in recent years. So I think Virginia used to be a red state, then it became a purple state, sort of a battleground state, but now it's a solidly blue state. Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points. And it looks quite possible that the Republican candidate will actually win the election on Tuesday. Maybe not, though. But if he doesn't win, it's going to be a nail-biter election, it appears. And so that's really significant because it is a statement, I think, on a variety of issues. Among them would be schools, right? Critical race theory, and the story here a couple of weeks ago of the man, the boy who dressed up as a girl, went into the girls' locker room and raped a young high school student. And the superintendent, Scott Ziegler, who covered that up, lied about it, and now that's all come out. And so some of the things we've talked about, there's an example of that actually happening. And then the Democratic candidate for governor being very forthright in stating his position, and I'm sure you're aware of this at this point, but his position is that parents really should not have a voice in what is taught in public schools. And I think he's received a tremendous amount of backlash over that. And so it's made the race very competitive because people care about their kids. And so I think that's something really to watch this week. The second issue, which I think won't amount to anything, but it is happening, and that's the climate summit in Scotland, beginning today and extending over the next week or week and a half, perhaps. You might have heard in the media that Joe Biden is arriving with an 85-vehicle entourage. So, and of course these folks, I mean, you can't help but comment on the hypocrisy of some of this when so many of these people they're very elite individuals, and they all fly in on their private jets to talk about the catastrophe of our climate and how we have just a few years left and the world's going to just be destroyed. And we need to limit our carbon emissions and radically restructure how we produce energy. I listened this week to a brief speech given by Al Gore, and I just have to say, I mean, I'm so puzzled by it because I have to assume that Al Gore is an intelligent person, and he's making statements that are so unrealistic. Fossil fuels are key to our economic growth, and 80% at least of everything that we enjoy in terms of transportation, in terms of heat, you name it, in terms of electricity, it comes from fossil fuels. And so Al Gore's making these pronouncements that we've got to just end fossil fuels and that they've got to go. They've got to go now. And I just think Al Gore cannot think that that is a viable, realistic option. And so in my mind, it creates thoughts that are far more, that are far darker, that this is about power and it's about money. And you know, the Chinese and the Russians are not part of these discussions. They're busily building coal fire plants and so forth. And so it just seems like this whole conversation is so, it's really absurd, it seems to me, because it's so entirely unrealistic. But it's happening right now, and so I just mentioned that. The third one, which is potentially, I think, by far the most important of these three things to watch this week in the news, and that's the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is hearing the first of two appeals on abortion rights. And I'll read to you just a little bit from an article here. I think this is big news, and I don't know where this is going to go, but it's very interesting. The Supreme Court will embark Monday, that's tomorrow, on the first chapter of a legal saga over abortion that could see the nationwide right to the procedure sharply limited in coming months. It will mark a fresh look at a socially divisive issue with a 6-3 conservative high court majority poised for politically charged rulings. The justices over the next month will hear separate challenges to restrictions on abortion access enacted by Mississippi with its ban after 15 weeks of pregnancy, and Texas with a more restrictive 6-week ban. The Texas dispute will be heard first in 2 hours of oral arguments Monday, which will be more procedural in nature and not likely to address the key question of whether the state's law restrictions on most abortions are constitutional. The high-stakes debate will happen December 1st, when Mississippi's law will be argued before the 9 justices. The state wants key Supreme Court precedents permitting abortion, known as Roe, 1973, and Casey, 1992, struck down entirely. The opportunity for a sweeping pivot on abortion at a time when the High Court's own reputation and legitimacy is threatened could be tempered by an unpredictable, cautious court that has shown it is not always eager to speak along sharp ideological lines. That may produce split rulings with uncertain, lasting impacts. And then it talks in this article about the Texas law, the Mississippi law, and I'll just read one more paragraph. It says about the Mississippi law, the more direct challenge to abortion rights lies in Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health Organization, which will be presented to the justices exactly a month after the Texas case at issue. Whether all pre-viability prohibitions on elective abortions are unconstitutional. Did you hear that? At issue whether all pre-viability prohibitions on elective abortions are unconstitutional. Mississippi officials are boldly asking the court to overturn its 1973 Roe v. Wade precedent, under which abortions are legal nationwide until the 24th week, the point of viability where the fetus can survive outside the womb. Then there's this statement. This is a Fox News poll that was out late September that shows that 65% of Americans favor keeping Roe as the law of the land. That includes, for the first time in the survey, a majority of Republicans. Just 28% want the ruling overturned. But then there's a strange statement. The next sentence, there is an even split on whether abortion should be legal. You see the discrepancy there. I mean, 65% want Roe kept in place, but half the country thinks abortion should be legal and half thinks it should be illegal. So regardless, I do think that most Americans, these surveys are interesting because it seems that they suggest most Americans don't want Roe overturned, but most Americans also do want real substantive restrictions placed upon abortion. And so most Americans seem to want to, split it down the middle somehow. And yet this case going before the Supreme Court from Mississippi is asking for something far bigger than that, where the court could actually overturn Roe v. Wade. And Veronica has a question, but let me just throw out this thought. We've seen so much in our country in the last couple of years where protesting and rioting and anger and violence, man, when I read this, I think this issue has the potential to really turn this country upside down. And it could have a huge impact on not only the midterms of next year, but the presidential election in 2024. And so the question is the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court of the United States has, especially John Roberts, has seemed to really be deferential to precedent and to wanting to kind of find a middle course. And you can't really find a middle course on this issue. So what is going to happen here? This is, I think, potentially huge. And from my perspective, does the Supreme Court of the United States have the conviction to make a right decision, even though politically speaking, John Roberts wants the court to be non-political, and that's impossible in our current situation. And then, of course, the left wants to pack the court and rearrange the court. And you see how this issue becomes a kind of a bullseye on the court. So it'll be very interesting to watch what happens. And I'm speaking in a very monotone, civil voice. This is not going to be civil. Yeah, especially if the Supreme Court puts real restrictions on abortion. The left in this country is going to go ballistic. Okay, Veronica.
Well, so does that mean that if they overturn, does that mean that every state, not just Mississippi and Texas, or is that what you said, Mississippi?
Yes,
States. Does that mean that every state will have restrictions, or just those?
That's a really good question. And if Roe v. Wade is overturned, all state legislatures will be wrestling with this question. And I don't think it would be the end of abortion. It would go back to state legislatures, and I think probably those if legislatures pass laws, and those laws would make their way to the Supreme Court. That's a good question.
I wonder what it means for like us and...
Well, like say New York State passed a law to codify Roe v. Wade. You know, so Roe was a Supreme Court decision. Abortion was made the law of the land through a Supreme Court decision, not through Congress, not through a law passed. And so the Supreme Court invented the right to abortion. And so New York, anticipating what's happening here, about a year ago, went through their legislature and actually put into law abortion on demand. Oregon might do something similar to that. Then you have states like Texas that would do the exact opposite. And so I think you'd have the whole thing you've got different states going in totally different directions, and I think all those cases would then go back to the Supreme Court. So this would probably be a legal battle that would go on for a long time. But overturning Roe v. Wade would be an enormous change. Did someone else raise their hand?
I was just going to share that on the Intercessors for America website, they've been doing like a 50-day for prayer for a specific topic, but I don't know what day they're on, but like they have like certain prayer points and things for like all the Supreme Court justices and their clerks and the petitioners and the respondents and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the court right now has 3 liberal justices. It has 3 really, really conservative justices, and that's Samuel Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas. And then you've got Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett and Roberts. And Roberts is the most moderate of those, but Kavanaugh and Barrett, you know, those are kind of the swing votes, and where are they going to fall on this? And I don't think anybody knows for sure.
And they're both fairly new, so they don't have a lot of history in there.
They don't.
Have a lot of work.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be constitutionalists.
Yes. Yes, they should if they follow their own philosophy of how to interpret the Constitution. You could predict how they would fall on this. But human nature doesn't always, it's kind of hard to predict. But I don't know if any of you paid attention. I assume you've been paying attention to Kristen Sinema, the Arizona senator, who's one of 2 who's been blocking the Democrats and Joe Biden's agenda in terms of these massive spending bills. So you got Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, and the harassment that Sinema's been subjected to, of people following her into restrooms, men following her into restrooms with cameras and trying to interview her or harass her, saying, you know, you need to get with the program, you need to change your ways. And I think it was yesterday, she officiated at a wedding for a family friend. And it was, of course, a private event, but there was a protest outside the venue. And they had blowhorns, and they were screaming and yelling, and the bride was crying, and the mother came out and said, "This is a wedding, it's not political, would you please let us enjoy this day?" And the protesters, well, some of them calmed down, but others continued to yell, So that kind of radical response, I mean, this issue is like a piece of dynamite. And if conservatives were to win the day on this, that dynamite will blow up. And I don't know what that will mean for this country. So it's something really worth watching, and it's really important, obviously. So let me read you a passage of Scripture before we turn attention to the other subject of today. Psalm 139. This is a great psalm. It's a psalm of David, Psalm 139. And a number of God's attributes are on display in this chapter, including the idea that God is omnipresent, that there's no place that you can go where God is not to be found, that God is omniscient, that God knows all things, that his knowledge is inexhaustible, there's no limit to his knowledge. And David starts to reflect upon his own life and how God has been present with him throughout the totality of his life. And it has reference to the whole discussion of abortion, beginning specifically in verse 13 of Psalm 139. And so as we try to think through these issues from a Christian worldview, it's important that we ground these things in the Bible. And so why do we as Christians, and hopefully this is true for you, it is certainly true for me, that I think life is sacred and that life begins at conception and that God has a concern for these issues. And it's passages like this one that lead me to make this affirmation. So David writes, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." And of course, David is using the word earth here, or the depths of the earth, as a metaphor for the womb. Because you put a seed into the ground, and from that seed, something beautiful hopefully grows, right? Something useful grows. Unless it's puncture vine, there are exceptions. I don't know, does puncture vine even go into the ground? It seems to just grow right on top of the rocks. Right? Think of a flower or a vegetable or, something that's beautiful. And that's the imagery being used here. The womb is this place where life happens. And it's marvelous and it's mysterious, even as to ancient people, a seed going into the ground from which a beautiful flower comes. It's just, how's this happen? Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was not one of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. And so this reminds us that the child in the womb is not just a biological process that's going on there. God is present in that place. And so the womb becomes a sacred place. And life is sacred, of course, also because it's made in the very image of God. So Christians cannot, I don't think, consistently be pro-abortion, although I know many Christians who are pro-abortion. And I just find that totally inconsistent with a biblical worldview. All right, any other thoughts on any of those three issues? The governor's race on Tuesday, Supreme Court beginning tomorrow, and all the elites in Scotland for the climate change conference.
You talk about Biden's vehicle. They said, I heard that there was a fleet of Teslas that brought in so that all these important people could drive their Teslas. But the hotel or the venue that they're at only got one charging port, so they had to drop off
Yeah.
a whole bunch of diesel generators.
Yeah, and that's the thing, even with an electric car, I mean, where's that electricity coming from? You know, when you source it back, you know, I don't know the truth of this. I've read this, maybe some of you have read this, and maybe you know more about this than I do. If you do, please tell me this. But, you know, I've been reading that President Biden's been really putting pressure on American oil companies to cut production. Is that true or is that not true? I've heard that. I don't know if that's true. I've not confirmed it, but I've heard it. But I also do know this, and I have heard this, that President Biden is really pressuring OPEC to increase production. And so if this is true, then we're limiting our own self-sufficiency, so we are forced to buy fossil fuels from nations that really are, you know, really do not like us much. And some of these nations are ideologically enemies of us. So you see how political this gets, and it just is so, it's so sad.
You don't let your enemy be responsible for your pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, we've learned that, right?
Tell us that each stand and our argument forces are
Yeah.
not working.
But we don't hear anything about changes in the immigration process. It's still kind of moving forward.
Yeah.
That's not important.
Yeah.
The frontline issue is this stupid electric car that can cost us more than $6,000
every half.
Well, those are Mexican immigrants. Yeah, that policy, which has been in the news, and it goes back to the Trump administration and parents and children who were separated at the border. And the Biden administration, I think it's in the funds that they're trying to pass. So if this big spending deal passes, and this is so interesting too, because the moderates and the progressives are at each other's throats over this, right? The Democratic Party can't unify to pass these things. But there's tremendous pressure to get them passed because Biden wants a win. But in that legislation is $450,000 for every adult who had a child separated at the border. So when they came into the country illegally and broke the law, and there was a separation that took place. So and of course the separation, I don't know all the reasons for that. I know that's been hugely controversial. Maybe it wasn't the best policy, but I think there were a lot of concerns about, you know, these children. Who are these kids, and are these actually the parents of these kids? It's a complicated, messy situation. So the Biden administration's wanting to give $450,000. So if you've got a child with two parents, it's $900,000.
So I'm flying to Mexico for my passport.
And I think a lot of people find that objectionable because it's taxpayer dollars that are given to people who are coming into the country illegally, and, you know, we're paying for that. And someone pointed out, and I've heard two different numbers for this, maybe you know, but if you lose a son or a daughter in combat, it's a $400,000 payment to the family. And so, you know, I've got a son in National Guard. If something happened and he went overseas and was killed in combat, we'd receive a $400,000 check, I guess. But if Maria and I had a separation at the border, we'd receive $900,000. So, again, you just, it's tempting. Hobbs, what are you doing this week?
Part of that goes on is this money's potentially going to sex traffickers because they can't prove that those children are their children.
That's right, and that's part of why this is so messy, because when all this was happening, you know, these kids were showing up, and there was a lot of confusion as to whose kids are these. Yeah, but again, I think it fits into the grid of the progressives, that the whole world is divided into two categories. There's oppressors and oppressed, and they've decided that these illegal immigrants are oppressed, and therefore the oppressors, namely us, should pay up. And to me, it's a world that's really upside down and backwards. And I say that realizing that immigration's a huge problem, and, you know, I'm sympathetic to people who want a better life, right? But the answer to this is for Democrats and Republicans to get together and to pass legislation. You know, and another thing in the news, here we're off target here, I realize, but, you know, it's been in the news this week that we're paying millions of dollars for contractors at the border to do nothing, because the border wall during the Trump administration, so much of that was, you know, the contracts were signed and the materials are there, and these companies who have contracts with the government will sue the government if they don't get paid. And so the Biden administration's position is, we're not going to build a foot of wall. Instead, we're going to pay all of these people to do absolutely nothing. And of course, you might have heard that there is one wall being built right now for border purposes, and it's around Joe Biden's estate in Delaware on the beachfront, a $500,000 wall that the taxpayers are paying for. So he has a wall, but the people on the border, ranchers and so forth, are just sort of left to themselves.
Washington, D.C., the Capitol and everything is fenced off again.
So we're not talking about immigration today, but that's been also in the news, and it's just a lot of things that a lot of people find pretty disturbing. So, okay? All right, well, let's look at our notes then. Where we left off last week was capital punishment and the Bible. What does the Bible have to say on this issue? And as I was thinking this week, and something that I heard something this week that made me think more about some of these issues, there's a lot of issues in our country where the church, for a long time, could kind of just remain in neutral or just sort of cruise along. The church didn't really need to make much of a statement or take much of a position, because the culture was going in the same direction as the church. And now it's the total opposite. And so, for instance, it was commented, the person I was listening to had a whole list of issues, and I didn't write them down, I don't remember all of them. But for instance, adultery in the United States was against the law. Divorce was against the law, at least without sufficient cause. And lots of issues of this sort that, homosexuality was against the law until, about 20 years ago maybe? And so for a long time, the church didn't have to even address a lot of these issues, because the whole culture was doing the church's work for it. And now it's very much the opposite way. So I was thinking, really, as part of this worldview class, I should have a couple of weeks on why sexual immorality is wrong. Because we believe that, that, don't we? But for a long time, that was just assumed in our culture, and you didn't really need to say much about it. Everybody knew that to be true, and so forth. And we're just living in such a different world now. So even something like this issue, where so many in the culture, and the Biden administration's position is that they will not enforce capital punishment, they're opposed to it. And so it does create the need, I think, for Christians to think through these issues. Because if we don't think through these issues, where are we going to land? We're going to land where the culture's at.
I see capital punishment of the discussion, not so much between culture and Christians, but between Catholics and non-Catholics. Catholics are very adamant capital punishment is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get to that eventually here. It's in the notes. And so this is an issue where there's a divide among Christians, where there isn't so much in some of those other issues. But let's look at this. Last Sunday we looked at Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And so I'm just going to read a paragraph here in my notes. It's sort of a summary of that discussion. So on that passage, these verses, they lay the foundational principles for all human governmental authority. At the very beginning of human society, after the flood destroyed the earth, God establishes that he will delegate to human beings the authority to carry out punishment on wrongdoers. By man shall his blood be shed. Therefore, the authority to execute punishment on wrongdoing has not simply been invented by human beings on their own. Rather, it is an authority that has been delegated to human beings by God. And through this authority, God carries out his righteous justice on wrongdoers, for he says, this is the way in which he will require a reckoning for the life of man. That's verse 5. Therefore, the authority to punish wrongdoing, presumably through some form of government that would be established, is given by God to human government. And such authority to punish wrongdoing also implies that human government will have to decide, A, what wrongdoing is worthy of such punishment, B, what punishment is appropriate for each wrongdoing, and C, whether or not an individual is guilty of that wrongdoing. And so last Sunday, what we primarily considered is that this is part of what's called the Noahic covenant. And the Noahic covenant is made with Noah and his descendants. And that includes us. In other words, it's not part of the Mosaic covenant, because many of the provisions of the Mosaic covenant have been fulfilled and therefore set aside. And so some people will say, well, you're making an argument for capital punishment from the Old Testament. Well, we know that much of the Old Testament isn't for today. Well, that's true if it's in reference to the Mosaic covenant and some of the stipulations within that. But the covenant made with Noah is made with the whole human race. And there's no reason to think that that has been set aside or abrogated. So God is the one who says that if you take life, you forfeit your life. And then God gives that right to governments to exercise that right as they see fit. And that to me seems to be the biblical position. Okay? The other passage that we'll look at is in the New Testament, and it's Romans chapter 13. So let's go ahead and turn there. Again, I guess I should say, because I shouldn't assume that you know this, capital punishment is the punishment that leads to putting someone to death, right? To execution. And right now in the national news, there is a debate over this because of the Boston Marathon bomber of several years ago. And that case is actually in the courts right now, and so it's kind of a contemporary issue. All right, Romans 13. This is, I think, the classic passage in the New Testament on the rights of government. We've wrestled with this text a little bit with our current situation with coronavirus. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, we realize that's not a universal statement. We realize there is a place for civil disobedience. We have examples of that in Scripture. If you think of Nazi Germany, you know, the thought that someone would resist the Nazis was not only permissible, but the right thing to do. But nevertheless, we are to, generally speaking, to recognize that government is a gift that God gives to human beings. It's been said that the only thing worse than bad government is no government, and I think there's truth to that. So Paul goes on to write, the rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority, then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. So Paul goes on to write, be in subjection. Verse 6, he says, we pay taxes to whom they're due, and so forth. Revenue to whom it is owed, respect to whom it is owed, honor to whom it is owed. But going back to verse 4, this is, I think, the verse that's relevant to this discussion. It says, for he, I guess in Paul's original context this would be the emperor, but we would think of this as government. He is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And so mention is made here of the sword, and the question needs to be asked is, what was the sword used for in that first century context? Now what's the answer to that? The sword was used to kill. Okay? So let me just read. This is Wayne Grudem. When Paul says that civil government is authorized to bear the sword, he means that it has been given authority from God to use the sword for the purpose for which people used it in the first century, and that is to put other people to death. So I think both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament you have a pretty consistent theme here that under certain circumstances, under the worst of circumstances, for the most heinous of crimes, that capital punishment is authorized by God in Scripture, and therefore I think that for me personally as a Christian, I am in favor of capital punishment under certain circumstances. Okay? Any thoughts?
John, one of the things that comes to mind is, especially with what we're going through now at the border, the number of prison beds that many states determine they need is based on third grade reading ability. And that they can judge how many beds they'll need because of these kids' inability to read. And many of the people that you see on death row at this point in time are illiterate. Mm-hmm. And that's a statistic that's proven. Thus, we go back to what we're going through now as a society, critical race theory, and all the things that are patently false. And we are teaching those things. We just bring about confusion, not only for the whole society, but in our educational systems as well. Mm-hmm. So it's striking, and I'd say to everybody, if you have a third grader, make sure you read.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I shared here a few weeks ago that 41% of people on death row are minorities. And that's a troubling statistic, right? That's a troubling statistic.
As you see these people come across the border, and what we are going to be required to do to support them in all aspects of life. Education, and think about what we have to do to educate these people, to teach them English, to teach them what our society is about. When we're giving conflicting messages through critical race theory and the wokeness and Black Lives.
Yeah. And I think part of what Kelly's saying, and I would affirm this, is there's a difference between the principle and the practice. You understand that? I'm saying that on principle, I am in favor of capital punishment for the worst of crimes committed in our culture. That's a principle. How that's practiced, there can be a lot of discussion that takes place at that level. In a culture where everyone is a sinner, and how do we practice capital punishment in a way that is actually right and just? And there's also the realization, part of the reason that 41% of people who are subjected or on death row or actually put to executed, that it's out of balance in terms of minorities, is from what I've read, if you have enough money, you can probably get off death row. You can lawyer up and work the system in order to avoid capital punishment, whereas if you're economically depressed or you're illiterate and don't know how to defend yourself, you're more at risk. And so the issue of how this is practiced, there's probably a lot of conversations and much improvement to be made, okay? So right now we're talking about the principle mostly.
Not only the literacy, the low IQ, which of course is widely literacy, but what concerns me is people who not just mildly low, but like in the 60s and 70s, who are on death row. Even if they knew what they were doing, there was, their thinking isn't clear. They don't have an understanding of consequences. And that doesn't mean, I'm all for life without parole and everything, but like you said, capital punishment should be very careful.
It should be reserved for the clearest and most heinous of cases. Yes.
Well, like the Boston bomber, I think he's a perfectly normal person who was radicalized. And he helped his brother commit the crime with the intention of killing me. That to me is killed a lot. That to me is a heinous crime.
Yeah, well, if you go back to, the young people in the room weren't alive for this, but Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, where you have people like him who really falls into the category, I think, of a profoundly evil person who did something profoundly evil. In a situation like that, it would seem pretty black and white in my mind, and he was executed, and that was a proper punishment for what he did.
Didn't take long to do it either.
And that's where you have another thing that's just really interesting within the society, is that you do have a fair number of people who will say, I'm opposed to capital punishment. But then when you mention someone like Timothy McVeigh, all of a sudden they do a double take. And they're saying, well, maybe in that situation, capital punishment should be permitted.
But the culture's changed enough that when Timothy McVeigh was executed, I don't believe there was a whole lot of support to save his life, right? Nobody was lining up and positive. But apparently with this Boston bomber, he's got people that are saying, let's think about this. How was his heinous act any different than Timothy McVeigh's heinous act?
I think Sean kind of alluded to part of it. With Timothy McVeigh, it was a quick execution of punishment. With this guy from Boston, it happened in 2013, where this many years out, and we've forgotten you moved on with life and forgotten how bad that was and how bad the news was the next day and throughout the few weeks. And I think that that's kind of on purpose to move us away from the emotional of this guy just killed a bunch of people.
Yeah.
The average stay on capital planning, on, death row is 22 years.
Yes, which at the end of this discussion, I do have a graph on the deterrence effect. I think that's in your notes. And there is a connection there when you don't have swift justice, it does incentivize bad behavior. There does seem to be a connection there that is concerning.
At some level, we need to, from a legal standpoint, separate the emotion of the event from what actually happened. So we need, at some level, we need to do that. Otherwise, we're exercising justice out of vengeance, as opposed to out of legal course. So we need that. But at the same time, like you're saying, if you're so separated that you don't have any connection to the original crime, then there's no deterrent to go do it. But incentivizing is not deterring. If I can kill someone and probably die in jail, where I'm getting fed and housed and all kind of stuff, and the other option is living on the street or whatever, take a choice, then there's an incentive almost to go.
Yeah, and the statistics prove that actually is true. That if a person knows that if I commit this heinous crime, that I'll never have to face capital punishment, or if I do, it'll be 25 years down the road, they're more incentivized to commit the crime. If they knew that if I do this and in 3 years I'm done, I'll get a fair trial and the appeal process will go through quickly, the statistics show that actually deters crime. So that's just the way the world works, and we can understand that would be true. You have a comment?
Yes. So I know a little bit about this subject. My family did it for over 313 years in Ireland.
So that means your family was part of the execution class, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
In that time period, they had to get permission from the Catholic Church before they ever swung an axe or a sword. In today's time period, pretty much it's a waiting period, because they are trying to wither out whether or not certain things took place. Unlike back then, where it was just a swift, quick killing. In the court system today, in the United States, a lot of people, even on the board of execution, have gotten rid of it in multiple different states. Oregon is one of the few states that does not do execution, but still has it as a second option. And the only reason they do that is because they feel that it is not necessary unless they absolutely have to do it. In the case of Balmer, I personally believe that he should be executed for the fact that he took so many lives that day, and on the fact that not only should he be executed, but also his brother, because his brother was also involved in the situation as well.
Well, his brother was killed years ago after the bombing. The police were hunting and chasing, and the older brother was killed. And he was considered more the mastermind, and he influenced the younger brother. And that's part of this whole conversation is the younger brother is guilty because his older brother had some influence over him.
He's just as responsible as the older brother was.
Yeah.
Well, that's the fight in the courtroom.
And one of the arguments about keeping the younger brother alive is he's so attractive. I mean, he was on the cover of, was it Time or Newsweek or something, and one of the discussions was, well, look at this attractive guy, why did he take him?
I suppose another situation would be this shooting of years ago in Charlottesville, where I don't remember the man's name, he was a white man, young man, a hater, and he went into the African American church and started shooting people during a Wednesday evening prayer service. And he killed, was it 9 or 10 people? And is his name Dylan Roof? Is that his name? And I think he's on death row now, and what will happen in that situation? I mean, what he did was so heinous and so evil that capital punishment would seem to be a fitting justice. In fact, it isn't justice, is it? In a situation like that, you can't really achieve justice, not in this world. In the world to come, you can, but in this world, you can't really achieve justice. But capital punishment would be the closest that probably can become to an approximation of justice. Before we close, let me just mention a couple of passages that sometimes are used to make a contrary argument. One of them would be the Ten Commandments, which in the older translations, I think the King James has it this way, thou shalt not kill. So there you go. Problem solved. Capital punishment's got to be out of bounds because it involves killing.
Until you get to Joshua.
What's that?
Until you get to Joshua.
Yeah, okay. The newer translations have thou shalt not murder. And, really the idea there is thou shalt not kill unlawfully. That's really the sense of what the commandment is getting at. Thou shalt not kill unlawfully. And so I don't think the Ten Commandments are an impediment to capital punishment. How about this text? This is Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5. Very famous text, and perhaps a text you've struggled with in various ways. He says, beginning in verse 43, Matthew chapter 5, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brother, what are you doing more than others? Do not even Gentiles do the same? And so Jesus says, and I guess I should have read the verses previous to that. So back in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's the principle of justice, right? Punishment befitting of the crime. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. So Jesus says, do not resist the one who is evil. So how do you interpret those words in the Sermon on the Mount? How should we understand that? Does that mean we shouldn't have armies? What are your thoughts? This is now a biblical interpretation question. How do you interpret Scripture?
I would say he's speaking individually, not government.
Yes, and yes, we're out of time, and so I'm going to say, and because that is the right answer. And so a text like this text, which is sometimes used by those on the other side of this argument, they're just misusing a text. This is a text that is addressing the issue of, how do we relate to people who we personally are at odds with? When he says here, if someone slaps you, turn the cheek and let him slap the other cheek. Well, the idea here is, back in the old days, if you've ever seen in the movies where you want to insult someone, and so you have two gentlemen, and one of them, he takes off his leather glove and he slaps you in the face with his glove. He's not meaning to do you real physical harm, right? He's insulting you. And so here it's the backhanded slap is the idea. If someone slaps you at the back of their hand, they're not putting you in the hospital. They're just saying you're a miserable human being. I'll give you an example of this as we close. A couple of weeks ago, I had a really tough week while jogging. I got bit by a German Shepherd. Maria said it was in my butt, but it's actually a little lower than that, okay? So she lied about it. But it was a 110-pound German Shepherd, and I was listening to a podcast, and I'm jogging along, and I look up, and I'm distracted, and this dog is on me before I could do anything. And I felt like I am totally at this animal's mercy, which I was. I showered up after that and cleaned my wounds and got some antibiotics because my brother's a doctor. That was useful. And then I went back to that house, and I talked to those people for some length of time and tried to minister to them because they were so upset about what their dog had done. She was coming home from work. She opened the gate. The dog ran out and attacked me. I'd ran by that house for years and had that dog bark at me from the other side of the fence. And I told him, I said, if you can find a way to not put this dog down, please do so. I'm not going to report this. I'm not asking to put this dog down. I also said, of course, and they realized, what if you'd been a child, you know? And then they said, what do my neighbors think? They saw this, and one of them came out and was giving me stuff for my wound. And so I said, I'll go talk to your neighbor. And I went and talked to the neighbor. I said, I had a great conversation with those folks across the street. I think they're wonderful folks. They're so upset about what happened. They don't know what to do. They want to do the right thing. After talking to that man, I walked out. The last thing he said to me, he said, have a good evening, Reverend. I didn't know he knew I was a pastor, and I had not said so. Well, a couple of days later, I'm running home, and I see this man, and he is viciously, savagely talking to his woman. I mean, vulgar in the extreme. I said, I can't just run by this. I don't know what's going to happen to this woman. So I stopped and I said, can I help you? And then all of a sudden, all his anger went from her to me. And he was F you, F this, F that. And I said to him, you know, I'm a pastor. I'm just concerned, can I help you? And then he said, your God is a dead God, and he said, you're probably a pedophile. He didn't use that word. I'm not sure he would have known that word. But he was speaking of the Catholic priest, and he said, you're probably a sexual offender. He's making the most obscene gestures. And that's where I did something I shouldn't have done. Because up to this point, I'd been turning the other cheek. He had been insulting me. I've never been talked to the way this man talked to me. It was vulgar in ways I can't even express. And I was so sick of it. I said, you know, you really are a miserable human being. And then he pulled out of his hoodie a screwdriver. I thought it was a knife, but it was a long screwdriver, and he came at me. This was the Saturday before you all honored me for 25 years of ministry. I had a moment of thought that I thought my life might end today. I really did. This guy's a lot younger than me. And because I got bit by the dog, on the second day I had my mace with me. And I maced the man. Now, I didn't get him in the face. I gave a warning shot, and he backed off. I came back, eventually called the police, because I was worried for the woman. They went to his house. They knew who he was, and he's a meth head. He was high on meth. But, you know, here's the thing. I didn't turn the other cheek, not ultimately. I was so offended that I said, you're a miserable human being. I should have not said that. But, you know, we find ourselves in those situations. Well, that's an extreme one, right? But that's what this is addressing. It's addressing when someone insults you as a Christ follower, how should you respond to that? It's simply not relevant to the issue of capital punishment. Okay. All right, we got to close. We got other things going on today. So,
Thursday night, when we were sitting out in front of Gary Stoltz, a couple came up, and the lady had really